Hello, this is Heart to Heart with Gary Rhinehart. I am your host, Gary Rhinehart, and this episode is brought to you by the Timberline Cafe, the Starbucks of the Adirondacks. Visit them at Route 30 here in Speculator for baked goods and some awesome coffee. I am here with Aaron Weaver of the Historical Society. How you doing, Aaron?
Hey, Gary. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing history of 1812. Now, we've had the 1812 reenactment before here.
Yes.
So this was a fairly important time in our history, and one that I think gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah, usually the War of 1812 and the early settlement of Lake Pleasant and Wells is a subject that's many times overlooked. And the reason, I think, is because, number one, the War of 1812 was somewhat of an embarrassment to the United States of America. Some people could have said that it was the Vietnam War of the early era. And also, it's a time that a lot of people think that wasn't important for our nation's history.
Mm-hmm.
On the contrary, it was very important. In fact, if it wasn't for the War of 1812, the United States today may not did not find its image, did not find its character, did not find what America is.
Yeah, it does kind of get lost between the Revolutionary War and Civil War and things of that nature. In terms of importance of the war, the War of 1812, and being on the reenactment as a total newbie I know the basics of the War of 1812 just from school, but not the in-depth, so to see it from that perspective was really nice, but I think it's something that needs to be expanded on. That's why we're here today.
Absolutely, yeah. I really wanted to talk about the War of 1812 and how it affected Hamilton County.
Mm-hmm. So, let's do a quick recap of just what was Lake Pleasant Speculator like, this area like in 1812?
Well, during the year 1812, Lake Pleasant and Speculator was mostly inhabited by the first settlers. The first settlers came in the 1790s, the late 1780s. And many of them settled in, of course, what we now call Wells and Lake Pleasant. And some even settled in parts of Arietta, which was part of Wells at the time. That was a Shaker community. That's a whole nother part of our local history. But what it was mostly farmers who was clearing land. And these kind of farmers were people who farmed livestock, like sheep and cattle and goats. And some of them even built mills for timber. Mm-hmm. And that was basically and also quite a few people own inns. So they're innkeepers as well for people who were passing through or were need a place to stay before they actually had a permanent home up here.
Mm-hmm. Now, so in 1812 we have settlers around this time, and then the war breaks out. Now, to my knowledge, the war never made it here personally. Or am I incorrect in that assumption?
How do I put it? We were lucky, or we were blessed in this part. Of course, got to keep in mind, we were northern Montgomery County at the time. Mm-hmm. And we were very lucky not to have any hardship per se that was caused by the war, but we were greatly affected by it because we did face enemy right here in our own territory.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes. A lot of people do not know that because it is a part of our history that has been forgotten. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I did not know this until the year 2012, when we were getting ready for our bicentennial. Lake Pleasant was formed in the year 1812, and I've discovered these letters that were written by the veterans of the war in our area, and I'm sure we're going to get to that. But it was shocking to find out what happened here and how we as a town almost became extinct.
Oof. All right, so let's do a quick history roundup, just for those who aren't familiar with the War of 1812.
Okay. The War of 1812 is not exactly a black and white war. You would learn in school that it was because many of the American sailors were being kidnapped by the British Empire to be forced into the British Navy. But there was more to it. This was a time of empires that were growing. The British Empire was expanding, the Napoleon Empire was expanding, the Prussian Empire was expanding, and Russia and other empires were expanding as well. And the United States of America, we were pretty much being picked on. We just became a nation, and we were young, and we were being pushed around by the other empires. France was pretty good to us, Napoleon. In fact, you could almost say that we were somewhat allies with Napoleon. We were always very close with France, even after they got rid of their monarchies. During the War of 1812, well, before the war broke out, Britain was having a problem with Napoleon, and many other countries with Prussia and such. And so they were trying to control Napoleon and stop his empire from growing. We as America, we bought a lot of land from Napoleon, which is why we have the Louisiana Purchase. But we also were not just being picked on by Great Britain because they were kidnapping our sailors, our merchants and such, but we also just went through a war with Muslim pirates out in the Middle East, and we were in great debt because of those pirates. But also, the British Empire still considered us as what you may call rebellious teenagers.
Right.
And they did not really recognize us as our own nation.
Yeah, they did not take that loss very well.
They did not take it very well, and they still wouldn't recognize us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why the War of 1812 was sometimes considered as the Second Revolution. So we thought, you know what, we need to get in the game. And there was a political party known as the Federalist. Mm-hmm. And they gained power in the United States of America through votes. And the Federalists were also known as the War Hawks because they were a little bit war hungry. They were the second generation after the American Revolution. And they thought, you know, why can't we also expand, because we want to become a great nation as well. And the British Empire is a little busy taking care of Napoleon. So let's get a little revenge, and to prove that we aren't as wimps as they think we are, and take over Canada.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Well, and they thought that Canada would welcome us with open arms because the British Empire was ignoring Canada at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a big mistake. Canada was not very happy about that. And Canada, even though they could not rely on the British Empire to support them, this was a time that Canada decided that maybe we should start learning how to support ourselves. So they formed their own British armies within their own boundaries. And as we went up to try and take over Canada, Canada was like, we're going to push back and we're going to push you down. And so this was basically a war between two countries of actually very equal ideas, but who they call this also the war between friends.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened. And so that's what's been going on. But the main thing that affected us was the Native Americans. And what happened was there was this new group of Native Americans of different tribes that got together, mostly Shawnees, and they called themselves the First Nation. And Canada promised the First Nation that if they won the war, this War of 1812 that we now call it, that the Shawnees would inherit, and many of the tribes who joined would inherit the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And well, guess where we were?
West. We're east.
We're
or are we west? We're
in the Appalachian Mountains.
So it's like, oh, we're right in the middle there.
Yes. So now it comes to where we are now, talking about.
Yeah. Now it's always weird when you hear that Canada was once under British rule, being, since a lot of people now kind of associate it with France and French Canadian and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Now, did England take over Canada around the same time as they they established the colonies, or do you know, is that like a different?
Canada was first because of Lawrence. Heard of the St. Lawrence River?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was explored by French explorers, and so Canada was known as Nova France, or New France. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but where we are now was part of New France. Yes. Here in Lake Pleasant, Speculator, and Hamilton County, a lot of it was part of New France. Then out broke many wars. There was the Queen Anne's War, the King George War, the King Edward's War. And there was many battles between France and Britain. And then out came the 7-Year War out in Europe. And this affected over here in the colonies, which we called it the French and Indian War. Mm-hmm. Well, while France was busy with Britain over in Europe, France told New France here in the French colonies, they told New France, they said, listen, the house is on fire. We have no time to take care of the barn. Mm-hmm. And so New France was on their own. Well, they couldn't, even with their Native American allies, they really couldn't defend themselves very well against the British Empire. And so eventually, after the 7-Year War, the French and Indian War, the British Empire gained all of Canada. But what really made Canada a true settlement was because of the American Revolution. Many of the loyalists, during the American Revolution, people were divided. They either had to be loyal to the king, or they had to be what we would now call patriots, people who supported independence or separation from the British Empire. Mm-hmm. Those who were not loyal to the king, those who were loyal to the king, the loyalists, who were mostly of the, at the time, Tory party, fled to Canada. And that's basically where Canadian history begins.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we got the basic general understanding of the War of 1812, now we can start talking about our part in it, I think.
Yes. You gotta understand that the War of 1812 was mostly a war that the politicians of the Federalists were pushing. And the American people themselves were not really for it. Again, this is why it's considered the Vietnam War of the early America. It is a war that's still argued between many people. And not saying that I'm against the Vietnam War or anything. I'm just saying
No.
it's just the thinking. at the
Yeah,
time.
you kind of get that parallel between politicians who want a war against people
Who didn't want the war.
didn't really want the war.
In fact, the American people were so against the War of 1812 that they showed it even during the wartime. During this time, there were militias. Militias were local citizens who, and it was constitutional. In fact, it still is in the Constitution, but it's constitutional that all American citizens should join a local militia to help defend their nation. And each state had its own militia. New York State had their militia. Rhode Island had theirs. Every state had their own militia. And as a result, in the Constitution, militias had the right not to go outside the border of the United States. And so the militias practiced this right. And so the citizens who were part of the militia refused to cross the border into Canada to invade it, which got the government mad. But it was the people's right not to. Another way that the American people protested was that New England, many of their farms, the food that they grown was sold to Canada. They continued to do so. So New England was feeding the enemy soldiers that were attacking us.
Oh boy.
So really, this was a war that had a lot of mixed feelings.
It definitely shows that our history of protest is not something new.
It is not new at all, and it's the right of the people to do so.
Right.
But because of that, it affected many people in the Appalachian Mountains and beyond out west. You got to remember that, well, you have to think of it this way. We were considered the western frontier, right here where we are, here in Lake Pleasant Speculator. A lot of people don't think of it that way, but we are. This was frontier land. This was new. We are still considered frontier land. But back then, we were the western frontier. And as a result, a lot of the people, they were just starting to plant farms and such. Because of this promise that Canada had, or the British Empire had, to the First Nation, we believe that this is one reason why the First Nation sent out scouts and explored much of the Appalachian Mountains. We have letters that state that these Canadian Indians, or what they called the Canadian Indians, or the First Nation, was in our territory. And they were hunting and fishing, and they were causing what we would consider terror to the local people.
Right. Now, I know the people at home can't see these letters that we have up on the board right now.
Yes.
Is this in the museum?
This is my own display. I do put it in the museum once in a while for display.
Because it was here in the library, wasn't it, for quite a while?
Yes, the library has allowed the Historical Society to use their display case to present local history, and we've had it in there for over a year.
All right, well, if you guys, the listeners, they come up for the summer, they'll have to ask to see if they can see their replications. It's not the real letters, but we've got kind of replicas here and pictures and stuff. Very interesting stuff. So definitely stop by the museum here in Speculator, New York, when you get the chance.
Yes, I'll also be using this for presentations.
For presentations and that.
But these letters, and that's what got me interested in the war of local history of War 1812, was that while we were doing research of the bicentennial of Lake Pleasant, these letters popped up on the Hamilton.nygenweb.net site. And I was reading these letters and I'm like, wow, we almost had a massacre here in Lake Pleasant, and there was great fear. And if you want me to, I can now start telling you my interpretation of the story of what happened.
Yeah, we can go ahead and do that.
During the War of 1812 was declared, and of course, people had to many people had to join the local New York State militia. And we were part of Montgomery County at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, there were very few of us. There was only 300 people within Wells and Lake Pleasant combined, if not a little more. And as such, people had to stay to keep the farms going.
Mm-hmm.
Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, they saw some Native Americans, what we believe from the First Nation, probably mostly Shawnee, were out in the woods hunting and fishing. But they were what the locals considered in their wild behavior, which means that they were basically causing a little fear and terror among the local people. And it worked.
Just by like their presence of being.
Just their presence and acting the way that they were.
Mm-hmm.
Their behavior worked. Almost everyone fled Lake Pleasant and went to local counties or southern part of Montgomery County, which is now also part of Fulton County. The only ones who stayed behind, and parts of Wells fled as well.
Mm-hmm.
The only people who stayed behind in Lake Pleasant was the Peck family. Yes. And the Peck family has a very interesting history.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, our town was in danger of not existing. You have to understand that at this time, most of Hamilton County, north of Wells, and half of Arietta, and other parts, was all Lake Pleasant, all the way up to the northern part of Hamilton County. So that's a lot of territory for a small town to cover.
Right.
And we've had settlements spread throughout Lake Pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
With only the Peck family staying behind and part of Wells people still in existence. William Peck, who's the son of Lorraine Peck, who, Lorraine Peck is a whole nother discussion.
Alright, we'll have to have that someday.
Yes. William Peck got a hold of a man named Francisco. And both William Peck and Francisco from Wells, John Francisco, made a petition to give to Governor Tompkins, who was the governor of New York State. They went to Albany. Now, gotta think of it this way: the roads were terrible. You could not take horses. The only thing that you could take was oxen carts, or you would have to walk. And they went all the way to Albany with a petition to ask governor to help them form a home guard militia.
Yeah, I can only imagine the oxen to oxen traffic on the north way down the Albany.
Yeah, it's quite a distance by wagon, but they did it. They were desperate. It's like, listen, they told Tompkins. I would love to see this petition. I have not. Someday when I do further research, I want to read this petition if it still exists.
Mm-hmm.
But they asked Tompkins, Governor Tompkins, Daniel Tompkins, that they said, listen, we need to form a militia, for one thing, to prevent a massacre from happening in Wells, but also to bring courage back in northern Montgomery County so that people will come back and be willing to guard their land. And Governor Tompkins says, yes, I will give you supplies from our armory. I'll give you everything that you need for warfare. I'll give you the muskets. I'll give you the ammunition. I'll give you the black powder. I do not know if a cannon was given to them or not. Probably not. I couldn't see a cannon being effective with what we would consider back then.
That would have been a good fear tactic, or a giant cannon.
It probably would have made the natives think twice, but it doesn't work very well with what we would consider back then savage warfare.
No.
But that's what happened. Tompkins gave us, and he says that after the war, bring everything that's left back. Give me back my ammunition. Give back my muskets. Whatever's left, bring it back. And so they said, okay. So they did. They formed the Home Guard militia. It was divided into 2 units. Mm-hmm. One for Lake Pleasant, one for Wells. They would also join together, and they would learn tactical warfare at the time.
Okay. So when we did the reenactment, which, if I remember correctly, was 2 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's the role that we were playing, right? We were the Home Guard militia.
We were demonstrating what it was like for Wells and Lake Pleasant at the time to learn how to muster, learn how to learn discipline, tactical discipline, mm-hmm. During the War of 1812.
Now, the people that were rounded up for this militia were not militarily trained, right?
Only, as far as I know, there were some Revolutionary War veterans, but the Peck family, according to my research thus far, was the only military trained family. Loring Peck, the father of William Peck, and some other Pecks who lived there, was a captain during the American Revolution. He became a colonel when he started officing militias in Rhode Island.
And this would be the Colonel Peck that's famous now.
This is the Colonel Peck that's famous now, yes. His son, William Peck, and his other son, who became, I forgot his name, became a judge of Wells. It's right here.
Richard?
Richard Peck, thank you. He became a judge in Wells, yes. In fact, Richard Peck wound up as the surgeon of the Home Guard militia.
Oh, I wish I had that job. That would have been...
It's a bloody job. You don't want it. But they were military trained from Rhode Island.
Yeah, for those who can't see, the first letter is actually addressed from
Richard Peck himself
to, which would be Sarah S. Well,
no, it's it was written to Zara
Westbrook,
yes.
Esquire.
He was the attorney in Amsterdam, New York.
I gotcha. Yeah, it's kind of hard sometimes to see the letters. But.
Yes, and you have to understand that when you read these letters, spelling was not important back then.
That is also very true.
And so when you read these, you have to pronounce the words of what they're trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
So when I printed out these letters, I did it by how they wrote it.
Yeah. And we have tried to update some Wikipedia sites and stuff like that by using stuff that we've read. And so I know what you're talking about when it's sometimes very difficult to discern what they're talking about.
But what's so nice is that I'm glad that they did that because we can understand how they spoke.
Yeah.
So by reading the words, we can see how they pronounced words back then. But so that's what happened. We drilled and such, and we gotta understand. I mean, we're out here in the frontier, out here in the wilderness, and we are defending farmhouses that are miles apart from each other.
Right. And it's hard to try to put that into your mind, because even when we did the reenactment, we're at the pavilion, which is right next to the highway, next to a pavilion, a softball field. So you don't really get. It's hard to get that imagination. Like, this would have been a farm area with a farmhouse. And then there would have been another one miles away.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine that it was all cleared land.
Yeah.
acres and acres of cleared land for cattle and sheep and all that. In fact, the first laws was based on livestock that was made in Lake Pleasant and even in Wells. And yeah, it's hard to imagine that you're walking through the wilderness and all of a sudden you're in an open field. I think, just for our listeners, if you really want to experience what the roads may have been like back in the year 1812, follow the snowmobile trails during the summertime. There you will get an idea of what it was like. And that's why a lot of the first settlers didn't have horses. In fact, the first record of horses wasn't until after the War of 1812 when the Rhinelanders came up.
Right, because oxen, I would assume, are more of a powerhouse. They can pull things.
Yes.
They're not as fast, but you can.
In fact, when we're going to talk later on about the War of 1812 military road, it would have been oxen that was used to pull the cannons through the Adirondack Mountains to get to the St. Lawrence River.
Yeah. Now, well, during the reenactment, I remember I was wearing the hunting frock.
Yes.
The hat and stuff. So I would have been just a regular farmer.
You would have been a farmer, an innkeeper, or a lumberman, and that was it. These were simple folks, and a lot of people understand that. In early America, we needed our militias. Militias had three purposes. It was to defend your hometown. It was to help keep law and order, but also to help people to understand as citizens what it takes to be free, to have true freedom in our nation. And I think it's something that we forgot in our own country, but that's my own personal view. But yeah, back then, most citizens, a lot of people say, well, I've been asked many questions like, did we have uniforms? Probably not. These were farmers. They had to wear their everyday clothing. If they were called to arms, they had to leave what they were doing right then and now and go straight and find a location where everyone can meet and to form their militia. When they were farming, they had to have their musket with them at all times. When they were, and I don't even believe that they kept the women and children there. I believe that the women and children were kept in nearby counties to be safe. It was just the men who lived up there for the 4 years of war that was going on.
Now, how many, if any, direct attacks did we have in our area?
Well, that's just it. There's no records at all that there was actually a massacre. All we know is that there was more like fear tactics. All we know is that the Native Americans were just causing trouble to keep us on our toes.
So it's kind of like it was simmering, but it never boiled over.
Exactly.
Okay.
But we don't know exactly why the natives were there. We have two theories. Well, three. One, they were seeing how far the expansion of the settlements have reached in the Appalachian Mountains. Two, they knew about the military road that was being built, and they were probably seeing how much has progressed. Three, they probably were just seeing what kind of land that they were inheriting after the war ended. You have to understand, the Shawnees, they weren't familiar with the Adirondack Mountains. This was mostly, before the first settlers came, was mostly Iroquois or Mohawk hunting grounds and Algonquin grounds. In fact, even the Iroquois nation wouldn't settle up here. They only came up here during the summertime to hunt and fish. They mostly stayed further south and lived.
Oh, so even seasonal people.
They were
seasonal. We still had seasonal
they
people even
migrated.
Yeah. Something that's happened even then. Now, when you watch movies, you think in a battle it was always, at least around this time, you got one side, other side, you just start shooting at each other. Mm. Now, in an area like this, I would have to imagine it would be more a guerrilla warfare, as they would call it, because you have the trees.
Call it now, yes.
Yeah, because you have the trees, you have the mountains, and you don't want to be like right in the open to get shot. You would use kind of nature to your advantage. Would that be something? Would that be true, or would we try and say, "Hey, let's do this"? It's the right way.
You gotta understand that I wasn't there.
Well, from your best knowledge.
I'm telling the people who are listening.
The listeners, yeah.
So I wasn't there, and we're only relying on what records we have thus far. Mm-hmm. What we do know is that they were taught the art of war, which means the militia did train in lines. But here's something that's also very interesting. The Pecks were from Rhode Island, and the Rhode Island militias not only knew how to deal with Native Americans, they had Native Americans in their armies, even during the American Revolution. So the Peck families were very well acquainted with many different customs that different tribes had. Okay? Mm-hmm. And what's more interesting is that William Peck eventually left Lake Pleasant, and he went to, let me see if I can read it. See, this is why I have my notes here. He went to the state of Illinois. He went to Illinois, and he was actually in charge of keeping peace between the Native Americans and the settlers there. Mm-hmm. He was part of the Indian Department. Yeah. And so obviously William Peck knew a lot of handling Native Americans. So I wouldn't be surprised if William Peck had a lot to do with keeping the peace between any possible happenings between the settlers that stayed and the Native Americans.
Yes, it seems, as we were talking, it seems like it was a very just defense versus defense, where it's like no one wanted to make the first go, like no one wanted to go on the offensive and be like, let's wipe these guys out.
Exactly. In fact, this is basically the War of 1812 altogether. Mm-hmm. The local citizens, the American citizens who are in the militias, they always acted as defense. Mm-hmm. Now the United States Army and Navy, that's a whole other story. Mm-hmm. But as for the militias, they've always acted in defense. The Home Guard militia would probably always act, well, that's what the Home Guard militia is all about, was to defend your home. Mm-hmm. And so it was always a defense attack. And you got to understand that the First Nation, the leaders of the First Nation, I'm not going to pronounce their names, but the chiefs, mm-hmm. they were actually very civil. Mm-hmm. And they even told their braves not to harm the women and children, mm-hmm. and not to do any trouble unless the men give them reason to.
Right.
And you'll see that throughout the different states throughout the War of 1812, especially in Kentucky and Michigan. The Braves would usually attack a village, but they would always leave the women and children alone. They were very humane, actually, compared to other tribes in earlier wars. But we didn't know that. Lake Pleasant Wells at the time, we didn't know that. So that's why I'm assuming the women and children probably fled. We had no idea what this First Nation was going to do to us.
Now, when we did the reenactment, there was a Native American fellow. I didn't get to talk to him much, mm-hmm. but he was there. And you know him better than
Yes, Glenn. He mostly reenacts different tribes from the Iroquois Nation, mm-hmm. but he does a very wonderful job storytelling and demonstrating the Iroquois Nation. I haven't yet been able to meet someone of the First Nation or who portrays the First Nation.
Mm-hmm.
Because you got to keep in mind, even Native Americans today do not really want to talk much about the wars in the past. Their focus is to regain land and to recreate their nations and to educate their children and stay as peaceful as can be.
Right.
So we mostly rely on historians and reenactors who portray the First Nation. And I haven't yet talked to, I had talked to some online, and they are the ones who gave me ideas of why the First Nation was probably in this area. Because like I said, I don't do all the research. I rely on other people who know about these kind of subjects more than I would.
Right. Okay. Is there anything else more specific you'd like to? I know you wanted to talk about the military road a little bit.
If I could, I would like to talk more about the first settlers.
Well, we could do that.
During the War of 1812, we didn't have any schoolhouses.
Oh, big shocker.
Yeah. Well, that's because we just became a town in the year 1812, like Pleasant did. And that was when the war broke out, and it wasn't safe for our children to go to school when Native Americans were seen in the woods. So as a result, the first schoolhouses were actually, we even have records that they were log schoolhouses. It's very interesting. And I say that's interesting because most of the time schoolhouses during that time era were shacks.
Right.
Okay? So have a log schoolhouse meant that these schoolhouses were meant for defense.
Yeah. So like in the middle of a lesson, you're ready to batten down the hatches.
Yeah. Well, kids learn how to fire a musket as young as probably 9-10 years old.
Yeah.
So, these log houses that were built after the War of 1812 were built out of logs, very thick logs, and which was very interesting. But before that, kids if some of them did stay behind, they were probably taught by their mom or by an older relative of basics of reading, writing, and some mathematics or arithmetic, as some people want to say.
Reading, writing, arithmetic.
But the education of the people were not illiterate, as we would like to think. And their lifespans were a lot longer than we would imagine. Many of these people lived way into their 80s and 90s.
I remember, and people might remember, the last time we were together and discussed was the graveyard tour. And for people who weren't there, there was the one gentleman you talked about who was a veteran in
the War of 1812.
Until his 80s, 90s?
We think in his 70s he was still fighting and he joined the army. We think there might be a little confusion in the genealogy, but it states that he was in his 60s when he had his second wife after his first wife died. You see, a lot of people don't understand this, but back then it was the woman who died young. It was the men who had long lives. And most of the time, men would wind up having a second wife after the first wife dies, and they wind up with another half dozen children. And this was the case with Daniel Fish, who at the time, during the War of 1812, he lived, he settled near Cherry Brook, which was at the time called Fish Brook, named after him. And when the war broke out, he joined the United States military, light infantry, and he eventually died during the battle at Fort Erie in Canada. And I'm hoping I'll be able to reenact him someday. I'm getting his uniform together as we speak.
Nice. Now, is that why it's also called Fish Mountain? Or is that just happenstance?
Fish Mountain is named after one of his sons.
One of his sons. So it's the same family but different person.
Yeah, Fish Brook, or what's now known as Cherry Brook, is actually what flows into the Lake Pleasant, and that's behind the Peck family's territory.
Oh, no, I gotcha.
Yeah.
All right.
And I tell people, I said, probably the last time Daniel Fish saw his hometown was if he took the military road that went through Lake Pleasant. And that road was very important. That road would take you to the St. Lawrence area. And we believe, some of us historians believe, that road was finished during the war, for the War of 1812, because there has been cannonballs and other evidence that at least some kind of military marched through there. In fact, I believe down in Northville, one of the towns that's now part of Northville has records that there was a trading post down there. And when the men were called up to arms, the New York State Militia was called up, they stopped at the trading post and they gave the owner more money than what it was worth because they were in such a hurry to grab what they could before they went up toward the St. Lawrence area.
Now, how regular of an occurrence would it be to see a actual military group march through Lake Pleasant up to Canada?
It would have been an awesome sight to see them march. And they would have marched up through Gilmantown. And from Gilmantown, we believe that they marched through what was past the county buildings. And then they went across the outlet of the Sacandaga River, which back then was known as Round Lake. The Sacandaga Lake, which was back then Round Lake. And they went up through what we believe is Peck's Clearing. And they went through what some snowmobiles trails still exists until they reached the left northern corner of Hamilton County, and they just kept heading forward. There was an armory up there where it ended. The armory, that's why I have my records here, because my memory, I have so much information in my brain. It's
I mean, there's a lot to try and filter through.
The turnpike at Russell.
Okay.
That's where the military road ended. And there was an armory there. The armory doesn't exist, but the second armory that was built after it does still exist.
Yeah, it seems that some of the hard part of research, I mean, just from talking today, is the fact that a lot of these places were named one thing then, and of course, as time's gone on,
well, the names change.
The names change all the time. So it's like, oh, now I got to figure out what this was when it was, what was its original name then. Like you said, how Sacandaga Lake used to be Round Lake. Yeah. And then
Fawn Lake was Long Lake. Lake Pleasant was always Lake Pleasant. But even, and you have to figure out that, like Arietta and Indian Lake and Long Lake and all those places was Lake Pleasant at the time. And you have to also understand that when you do research of records, that we were part of Montgomery County at the time, so you have to go to Montgomery records. But it gets more confusing because Johnstown was part of Montgomery County and was actually the head of Montgomery County at the time, which is no longer is. And it always changes.
It's a lot, and for people who don't live here, to get just from where we are to Montgomery County, especially where they would probably keep records like that, is 45 minutes to an hour drive. So to do research, it's a lot of driving from this place to that place to this other place, and
thankfully the internet is very resourceful, and that I'm very thankful of the people who has been putting records from their counties onto the internet, because it helps a lot. And now there's a lot of maps that are being put on there that confirms a lot of historical research.
Yeah. I know doing my own research when I was volunteering at the museum, I believe it was the Hamilton County book by, and you can help me out. I think it was like King and.
Yes, we were talking about the Hamilton County history.
That book, and if the people that ever have a chance to look at it or rent it or whatever, it's a very informative book. The two authors did a very good job on the history of Hamilton County as they could.
And
of
what
course.
they knew at the time. Yeah, they did a magnificent job.
Yeah, it's a very and very famous book for this area.
They have a couple copies here in the library. You can't take it out of the library, but you can use it for research here.
Mm-hmm. And I know we have a copy at the museum as well.
Yes, we have a copy at the museum for research.
Yeah, which we also won't let you take out, but you can.
Nope, we won't let you take it out. These copies are very valuable to us.
Yeah.
Yes. But, and that's just it. I had to start a research from the book, because like I said, I had the letters.
Mm-hmm.
And from the letters, I went into the book. And sometimes they would contradict each other, but then when you have to understand that names changed, a lot of things changed, so they're not contradicting each other. It's just that what they knew at the time.
Right. Now, if someone wanted to do more of a hands-on exploration of where these areas would be, are they difficult to find? Where they would have practiced, where they would have done this, that, and the other thing?
You mean difficult to find the historical research?
Well, no, physical. Like if say I wanted to take a hike to an area, to a farm area, what used to be a farm area, or I want to take a hike to where they would have practiced.
Oh, you mean like drilled or where they would have had their log cabins or whatever?
Right.
Would it be difficult?
Because I have to imagine over 100. Well, no, at this point over 200 years, properties have changed and everything is all mixed up again.
It would be difficult to find because even with maps, they weren't accurate. Mm-hmm. And I have to understand that lands were not divided by, saying, here's the line. Mm-hmm. They were divided by, it was from this tree to this rock. Or the road went from this tree to this rock. It's even written that way in the historical town records.
And of course, the roads on the maps might not even exist now.
Exactly.
Because it's not like you can go, oh, it's this way off the highway, because there was no highway.
No, in fact, when I did research on the military road, I followed lots of Gilmantown Road. Mm-hmm. You can see across the river where there's a lot of flat areas where the road used to be, because not all of Gilmantown Road is the original. In fact, parts of the northern part of Gilmantown Road is new. It actually went off to the left toward Peck's Farm. And even doing research at Peck's Farm, you're doing a lot of assumptions here because you're relying on historical records, what buildings may have been available, and then you're guessing, well, is this the building, or was this another building, or was this even a building? So there's a lot of assumption. We're relying on people's oral letters and...
Now, was record keeping that important during that time, or was it kind of like something that really was on their mind?
Record keeping was very important back then, but the resource to keep those records weren't always available. Mm-hmm. Here's something else. One of the letters here that I have mentioned that there was a fire.
Yeah. And
a lot of that was lost. A lot of the research that we needed was lost. And a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of New York State research was also records. That was also lost in a fire.
Yeah, we tend to have a lot of fires around here.
Fires is the biggest enemy of historians.
Yeah.
And it happened very often.
Yeah.
It's sad, but it did.
Yeah. So, do you have any more you would like to speak about the War of 1812?
I'm going to be doing a presentation in August for the Historical Society of Piseco Lake. about the War of 1812. I'm hoping this year I'll be putting together a documentary video, and I'll be putting it on YouTube, but also hope to be having that done before the presentation in August. And tickle my brain, ask me questions, because even if I don't know the answer, it'll give me something to be willing to research about. Like, for instance, I was asked, was there like a blockhouse or a fort built up here? And there's no evidence that there was anything like that, but knowing the Peck family and their history, it wouldn't surprise me if their log cabins were militarily defensive. It was military defense. So it wouldn't surprise me if their log cabin was somewhat like a blockhouse design, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, I right now we're in an era of a lot of assumptions, and we're relying on other research of the lives of the people back then to compare it to what it may have been like for here.
Now, do you ever see having the ability to make these assumptions more concrete, or is this something that might just be lost to the annals of time?
Well, I have written a chapter in a book that hopefully the Historical Society will get printed very soon. And in that, I write down my personal views of what life may have been like during the first settlers in the War of 1812, to give a more romantic look at things. If you know what I mean, romantic, not as a lovey-dovey, but more as a colorful...
Ooh la la.
Yeah, more of a colorful insight of the lives of the people. And not just the men, but the women and children as well.
Okay, so now, once the war was over, first off, there's always the famous story that the war was over and the news didn't get to certain parts in time.
Many of our major wars of the War of 1812 happened after the peace treaty was
signed. What was it? The Battle of New Orleans was a bit.
Yeah,
was usually the examples like, it didn't get to them in time to tell them, hey, we don't have to fight now.
Yeah.
But then after that, what was the area like? So the war's over. People, I assume the women and children came back.
Yep, and the schoolhouses were built. That was in the town records. See, we're relying on town records of what happened after the War of 1812. And we do know that schoolhouses were built. We know that some of the families came back.
Right.
Not all of them. A lot of the first settlers never came back after the war. But some of the families did come back to Lake Pleasant. We basically had to start all over again. William Peck wound up as supervisor.
Nice.
Yes. And this was a time when Hamilton County was becoming a county. We were still under Montgomery County for a while because we didn't have enough people to become a county, but it was already in the making. This was when people more local to the area, like New York City, came up and settled, like the Rhinelanders. They had a big effect on the eastern side of the lake, Lake Pleasant, and so more settlers came up there. For a while, we relied on what were they called? People who sold their ware.
Merchants or
not merchants.
Not merchants.
Peddlers. We relied on peddlers, but then William Burke Peck built the first general store, first trading store up here in Lake Pleasant. So after the war, we finally began to form a good settlement. And then Sageville was built and became the head point of Hamilton County. The head of Hamilton County, which is now Lake Pleasant. Here's the head, which now came back to becoming the town of Lake Pleasant. So we were people were no longer afraid of Canada. We became friends with the British Empire per se. Of course, that's still under argument because the Civil War, the British Empire had a little bit of their hand in that, but that's a whole nother story. But most of all, we became friends with Canada again, and so people were a lot less afraid to settle into the Adirondacks. Eventually, Lake Pleasant was divided into other towns, which is what we now see today. In fact, parts of Wells became different towns as well, like Hope and all those places.
It's weird to hear the phrase "we were afraid of Canada," being that they kind of have that what do you call it? Like that conception of being such nice people. But I mean, I understand. I mean, when in wartime,
you had to do what you had to do. In Canada, they felt like they had to defend themselves. And it was hard for Canadians to fight us because even along the borderline, just like today, there was intermarriage. And in fact, Captain Brock, who was one of the main generals during the beginning of the War of 1812 before he was killed, he went to church on the American side. And he told his reverend, he said, "This is the last time I'll ever be able to come to one of your sermons." And it was a hard time for that congregation because it was divided in two because of the war. Because religion was a big factor back then.
Of course. Yeah, and it just shows that conflicts like that always tend to split people up and things up.
It split people, it split congregations. Denominations were much divided because of warfare. Families was divided, nations were divided. War is never a pretty thing.
No.
And I think the War of 1812 should be a lesson for our nation to never anticipate war.
Right.
Like we did back then.
Yeah, and it's definitely a war that I think needs to be more. I don't know if popularized is the right word, but I think it needs to come more to the forefront than it has. You know,
Yes.
Like I said, everyone knows the Revolutionary War, everyone knows the Civil War, but every example of war has its own lessons to teach.
Absolutely.
And it's great that we got to sit down, we got to talk about it.
Yeah.
If you would like to have more information, the museum will be open, Memorial Day weekend?
Yeah, from Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day weekend. And, contact me. A lot of people who know me, I work at Charlie John's store.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to talk about my insight on the War of 1812 and how it affected this area. And other questions about the early settlers of Wells and Lake Pleasant.
And you can always contact the Historical Society on Facebook, correct?
Yep, on Facebook. That's the best way to contact us. And, if you have questions, we may not give you an answer quickly, but we will either give you links to our local historians or we will give you our answers as soon as we can. And even if we say we did not know that answer, it doesn't mean that we are not going to look into it.
There has been plenty of times when I volunteered that we didn't know the answer, and then you and I researched, and then we got the answer, and then sent to the person, like, here's the answer that you wanted. So,
or the best that we could.
The best we could come up with.
Yeah.
So I want to thank Aaron Weaver for stopping by and giving us the insight into this unfortunately much forgotten war. So for all of us here at Dackland Radio, this was Heart to Heart with Gary Rhinehart, and we hope to see you next time.